Hello horror hounds, and welcome to my continuing A to Z of horror, thoroughly inspired by Jambo Shango and Randy Mole's own A to Z of horror series. I will link to their B entry in the description field down below, and I urge you to check them out. To know them is to love them. But for me in my house of horror, B is for the Blob. Whenever there's talk of the glut of remakes and reboots that are around, and remakes are never as good as the originals, us horror fans have some old faithful standbys, some go-tos. John Carpenter's The Thing, David Cronenberg's The Fly, Philip Kaufman's 1978 Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead has got a lot of heat to it now. People are liking it as part of the under the Evil Dead banner. Horror seems to have more better remakes than lots and lots of other genres. I'd argue that Chuck Russell's 88 remake of The Blob really does deserve its place in that pantheon of superior horror remakes. Hot off the success of directing Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. You might have heard of it. Chuck Russell was adamant that he wanted his next film to be a remake of The Blob. Back on board, he brought his Dream Warriors co-writer Frank Darabont, who by now has his own horror cred that really is none too shabby. The Blob 88 screams its 80s credentials in a way that's probably only exceeded for 80s cred by The Lost Boys. It hits the sweet spot of practically everything it goes for. The kind of perfect Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, between horror and entertainment that only a few other films really attain. Fright Night, Gremlins, American Werewolf in London. It boggles my mind that it has kind of fallen down the back of the cinematic sofa, destined to be referred to as a forgotten gem, while those other films that I've listed off so far are rightly hailed as classics. This film is so much more than a forgotten gem. Basically, up, down, front to back, start to finish, this film is an absolute blast. It's bolder than the original, badder than the original, much, much more violent, actually intentionally funny and almost effortlessly entertaining. The Blob itself is so much better in every single way than previous iterations from the original Blob and Son of Blob, which in the UK is what we call Beware the Blob. Progression in special effects technology is almost always a very bad reason to remake a film. And yet here the Blob even gets this right. Whilst the original Blob was an amorphous mass, this Blob is full of 80s attitude, incorporating every trick in the SFX playbook at that point. The entire arsenal is brought to bear to bring the Blob to life. Amazing practical effects, front and rear projection, miniatures. This actually gives the Blob, it's strange to say it of an entity called the Blob, an actual character, a bag of tricks. The Blob is predatory. It can send out pseudopods, it can hide on ceilings, dropping on victims, it can overwhelm using ambush attacks. It's fast. It seems instinctual, just the merest hint of instinct or a rudimentary intelligence that makes it seem so much more formidable than just the mindless, amorphous thing in the original film. Blob, not The Thing. And just as John Carpenter's The Thing very clearly comes from a place of love for the original movie that Carpenter remade. Chuck Russell's The Blob harkens back to its movie's 50s roots, but continually subverts them at every turn. This is an 80s movie through and through. So whilst the look of the film is shot through with 50s iconography, the attitude is from 30 decades later with jokes about buying condoms and the Blob's first victim not having medical insurance. There's a healthy dose of government conspiracy. In the 50s, Steve McQueen says, the first thing he says when he realises that things are going wrong is that we need to go to the police. And he says they'll know what to do. There's a healthy 80s cynicism of law and order, government officialdom, that's actually paid off with the extra twist added to this one of the government conspiracy. It is just such an astoundingly entertaining roller coaster that's so easy to have fun with that it manages to almost smuggle in some of the most consistently grisly and extreme death scenes you could possibly hope to see. It's really, when you take a step back from it and don't get swept up with it, an astoundingly violent movie. Yet it's such a romp that my girlfriend, who doesn't really dig like ultra-violent movies, completely and utterly enjoyed it. I don't know how to describe it. It's not cartoony. The Blob itself is kind of cartoony. What the Blob does to flesh and bone is absolutely horrific. But the movie's got such an energy, a lightness, a breeziness to it that maybe the violence doesn't hit as hard as it. Maybe it just takes the hard edge off it. If you took the kill scenes in isolation and just watched them, the practical effects, the half-digested bodies, the fact that this film is willing with absolute abandon to kill off characters and loved characters, left, right and centre, people that you really care about after a short space of time. And the lady working at the diner and the sheriff have got a budding romance, and that's really quite sweet, and I'd like to see this go somewhere and I wish them all the best. No. But yet the movie manages to jolly along and go, hey guys, don't worry about it. It's not too bad. Come on. Let's see who the Blob's going to get next. And you're kind of like, yeah, come on Blob, eat someone else. The original Blob ended with what now seems like an insanely prescient little coda where the trustworthy government takes the Blob, who doesn't like the cold, and drops it in the middle of the Arctic. Maybe it sat there somewhere near the Thing. In my head, that is exactly what's happening. And everyone's going to be fine. And Steve McQueen says at the end, unless the Arctic stops being cold. Now, I'm really not sure that global warming, climate change was a thing back then. Watching it now, it's sort of like what was a wah, wah, wah sort of like joke to end on is now sort of a, ooh, that's a little close to the bone. Here, the coda is much more of the vibe of Stephen King. There's the very Stephen King-like priest turned evangelical prophet of Armageddon at the very end. Perhaps it's not surprising because this is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, co-written by Frank Darabont, who he has form when it comes to adapting Stephen King works. So, a movie made about 30 years ago was a remake of a movie that had been made 30 years previously, basically because special effects technology had advanced to such an extent that you could really do new stuff with the Blob. And it was a knocked it out of the park, smash success. Does that mean I think we should have a remake of the Blob now? Absolutely not. You see, a new remake of the Blob would necessarily incorporate computer technology, CGI. And that would render the Blob strangely soulless, which is a strange thing to say about an entity called the Blob. But the 80s bag of practical effects seems again to hit such an amazing sweet spot, improving upon everything that came before it, but with all the tools then at their disposal before computer technology kind of took over everything. So it still managed to maintain its sort of status as having a loving regard and a fondness for the film that came before it, that I think would be completely lost if the Blob, the CGI Blob, were made today. I see Blob 88 as, to the original Blob, as Hammer's The Mummy is to Universal's The Mummy. And if the Blob were remade now, the equivalent would be Tom Cruise's The Mummy. And no one wants to see that. Next up for C is a film I haven't watched in a long time. I'm very excited to rewatch it, and I'm going to leave you with a little clue as to what C is going to be, and I hope you will be able to join me then.